Is your PS5 suddenly overheating? Did Microsoft just leak the PS6? And did Sony accidentally cancel Starfield on PS5? How's it going, everyone? Welcome to PSReady. This is the early week news update. I'm here in my new studio. I'm still working on it. I did the 3-day drive cross country with my best friend over the weekend, and I'm still adjusting to this new time zone. But yeah, I'm getting everything set up down here. I got my Boba Fett helmet, my Mando helmet, and my Michael Myers Halloween Kills mask, and some other stuff back there. So yeah, it's gonna get better as time goes on, but let's just jump into this first story here in the video. So Final Fantasy 16 is out. I haven't gotten a chance to play it. I spent all day yesterday getting my TV mounted, my soundbar mounted under the TV, and I cable managed as best I could. And now my PS5 is set up with Final Fantasy 16 downloaded. I cannot wait to play it tonight. The reviews have been pretty much unanimously positive for this game. There were a few that stood out, like my buddy Ralph over at Skill Up. He wasn't a huge fan of the new direction, but you know, for the most part, people really seem to love this game. A big reason for that, though, seems to be the scale of the game when you're in the bigger boss fights and the level of detail. So a lot of people are actually playing this game at 4K 30 just to get the most enriching detail as possible out of this game, and also because the performance mode, just like with Jedi Survivor, is not really much of a performance mode. It's like a 30 to 40 FPS mode that can go all the way down to 720p. So this is a game that I would definitely recommend using the quality mode on. But because of that, PS5s are overheating. So over the weekend, people were sharing in Twitter, Reddit, all the usual places that they were getting a message after playing a few hours of Final Fantasy 16 that said their PS5 was too hot and needed to shut down and cool off. Kind of like when you're out in the summer when your iPhone gets too hot and it says, hey, I'm getting way too hot, I'm gonna reduce performance, and if that doesn't work, I'm gonna shut down for a little bit so I can cool off. That's exactly what was happening with the PlayStation 5. The difference is this was just happening from playing a normal PS5 game, which is pretty alarming, right? Because if you think about things overheating like your laptop, your phone, your PS5, the big fear is that they're gonna overheat to the point that they'll damage the APU. And overheating is never really an issue that's happened to me with my PlayStation consoles before. My PS3, the Blu-ray laser, that's a really hard word to say. The Blu-ray laser broke while I was beating Uncharted 3. Like literally as the credits rolled, I couldn't restart the game, which really sucked, and then I had to get a new PS3. My PS4 Pro's disk drive broke, but yeah, never really had any issues with my PS5, so this kind of really sucks. Now, one thing that's kind of interesting to think about is like who's to blame in this situation. You could easily point the finger at Square Enix and say, hey, look at the performance mode in this game, it's coming in a little hot. It's not as optimized as it should be, so maybe it's pushing the PS5 harder than it needs to be right now. Or you could just look at Sony and say, hey, yeah, I understand that this game is pushing the PlayStation 5, but we're only a couple years into this console's life cycle, and there's no reason for these consoles to be overheating at this point because the vast majority of games we've gotten so far are ports from the PS4. It's a really weird situation, but there are definitely some things you can do to kind of take precautions for this if you haven't run into this issue yet, or if you have run into this issue, here are some things you can do to make sure it doesn't happen again. First of all, your PS5 should not be in an entertainment center, whether it has a door, an open back, or anything like that. If you put it in a little cubby area where it can just generate a lot of heat and blast that out around it, that's just gonna be a bad time for your console overall. Like regardless, even if it wasn't heating up, there's no reason to keep your PS5 in an enclosed space because that heat is just gonna collect there and it's gonna be bad for your console. Also, I recommend cleaning out the PS5 at least a couple of times a year. It's really easy to get the side plates off, it's very easy to get the fan out, it's very easy to get the SSD cover off, and once you do all of that, all you need is a can of compressed air. Just make sure you're careful about where you're blowing and in what direction. Like don't blow the fan backwards or anything like that. It should be a fairly quick and easy process though to just make sure your PS5 remains dust free. I have the dark plates on my PlayStation 5, so it's really hard to see this, but if you still have the white plates on your PS5, you're gonna be shocked when you take them off and notice how much dust has collected on the inside of those plates. Like I do a pretty good job cleaning at my old apartment. I made sure I kept all the dust and dirt picked up and everything like that, and still, every time I took the white plates off to kind of clean out my PS5, I had to give them a pretty good wipe down because that big fan is sucking in a lot of air, and with that, a lot of dirt and dust and everything like that. Another tip I've seen a lot of people sharing is to play in frame rate mode, which kind of sucks. Like even if you have a variable refresh rate TV, it's still not going to look very good if the game is going from like 30 to 60 FPS. It's dropping resolution down to 720p on the fly. Like, I would at least try to make sure your PS5 is in a ventilated area, maybe cleaned out of dust and stuff like that before I resort to using performance mode in this game. Another tip I've seen that I'm not really sure how much it'll help is to not use HDR with your console. I don't think HDR is really that taxing on the PlayStation 5. Like, it's not going to make a huge difference, but if you see your PS5 continuing to overheat with Final Fantasy 16, that's another thing you can try. And then finally, just wait for some patches. This game's obviously going to get some patches as time goes on to fix bugs, to fix the performance mode, to just fix all of the little things that happen when a game gets out into the mass market and they've got a lot of people testing it. That tends to bring the most critical bugs to the top of the surface, and I would say overheating PS5s is a fairly critical bug, so I don't think it'll take too long for Square Enix to figure out this issue. Next up, let's talk about this whole situation between the FTC and Microsoft, because all of that was happening over the weekend, and we actually got some pretty big PlayStation news out of this trial. The first thing I think is worth talking about is that Microsoft, unintentionally or intentionally, depending on how you're thinking about it, may have revealed how long this generation is going to last and when we'll see the PlayStation 6. So I'm just going to paraphrase this here. Basically what Microsoft is saying is, hey, we have a 10-year deal in place that we offered to Sony to keep Call of Duty on PlayStation consoles, and because they're going to wrap up this generation and move on to the PS6 in 2028, they'll get at least a year or two of Call of Duty on that console. Sony doesn't think the deal is good enough. Now look, I'm not going to get into the deal once again because we've talked about it ad nauseum here, and I'm just not the biggest Call of Duty fan, but 2028 makes this generation feel a little bit longer than the last generation, because the PS4 came out in 2013, and if my math is correct, that would make this generation at least a year longer than the last generation, which makes a lot of sense, mainly because the PS4 came out a little bit late because of the last recession we were in. The 360 and PS3 generation went on way longer than it was originally intended to. So Sony and Microsoft were essentially sitting on finished consoles for quite a long time before they actually released them. The PS4 then released a little bit underpowered, which is why they needed the PS4 Pro in the middle of the generation. But this time around, that actually doesn't seem to be the case. The PS5, you could argue, may have come out a little bit too early, since we're actually getting PS5 games for the first time about 2.5 years into the life cycle, and we are definitely going to get a mid-cycle refresh this time around, just because they want to get a console out there that can run PS5 games at 60 FPS. I am all for that, but because of that, these consoles are more powerful. They're coming out at the right time, and that's why I think this generation could be extended a little bit longer. And while yes, it does suck that we're getting to the point where the PS5 needs to run games at 30 FPS, I think it's worth keeping in mind that they're running these games at high settings and higher resolutions, which is good. And in the past, this is what we could have expected, right? Like, we couldn't even expect the PS4 to run games at a locked 30 FPS towards the end of that generation. And then for the most part with that console, games were running at 900 to 1080p at 30 FPS, and it was a fine experience then. I think it kind of sucks that people sort of saw the light that PC players have been seeing for a long time now with the beginning of this generation running games at 60 FPS. But if they keep pushing the envelope in terms of graphics and just overall fidelity, and keep making sure that games are as detailed and as rich as possible, I think people will understand the trade-off to 30 FPS. I mean, over on the Xbox side of the fence, Starfield's gonna run at 30, and it doesn't even look like it's gonna be a locked 30 at launch, and people are saying, hey, this game's really pushing boundaries, so I'm kind of expecting that anyway, and I'm happy to deal with it. So yeah, PlayStation 6 in 2028 seems like a fair deal, and it should make people who weren't able to get a PS5 for the beginning of this generation feel a little bit better with their purchase if they got it about 2 years in. I just hope that this generation doesn't have as long of a tail into the next generation, where we're gonna have PS5 games coming out for years on the PS6. And then the next update we got over the weekend is surrounding the whole Starfield Bethesda situation, why this game isn't coming to PS5. Obviously, Xbox owns Bethesda now, that's why it's not coming to PS5, but it turns out that it might actually be Sony's fault that Microsoft even set its eyes on Bethesda in the first place. So way back before the PS5 and Xbox Series X were even announced, there were games called Deathloop and Ghostwire Tokyo in development, and Bethesda had taken a deal with PlayStation to make sure those games were exclusive. Obviously, Microsoft wasn't a huge fan of that, because back in the day on the 360, with both games like Oblivion and Fallout 3, Xbox had exclusive deals with Bethesda to get DLC early, their games came out first, they ran better on Xbox, everything like that was really cool for them back in the day. So it turns out Xbox was already irritated to see these games becoming exclusive games for PS5 for at least a year, and then they heard some rumblings that Sony was actually going to enter an agreement with Bethesda to make sure that Starfield would be exclusive to the PlayStation 5 as well. So Microsoft said, hey, we're not gonna let that happened. This is going to be one of the biggest games this generation. We got to fight back a little bit. So what did they do? They went into their pocketbooks and they just bought the whole damn thing. Now, Microsoft's got in trouble with stuff like this in the past, specifically with Rise of the Tomb Raider. So there was the Tomb Raider reboot. That game heavily focused on marketing on PlayStation, mainly because it's Square Enix. And then Microsoft threw down a ton of money to make the sequel to that game exclusive to Xbox for 1 year, which obviously really rubbed people the wrong way. It was the middle game in a trilogy. It wasn't a brand new experience. And that's why I think this is a little bit different. And Sony kind of did a similar thing here with Deathloop and Ghostwire Tokyo. Deathloop got great critical scores. I would say it was overinflated in terms of how many 10s it got, but it was still a good game. I ended up finishing it. I got 100%ed it. I really liked it. Ghostwire Tokyo didn't do well critically, and I don't think either of those games sold very well. So Xbox's perspective there is that Sony is just paying to keep these games off Xbox for no reason, and yeah, they basically had to put their foot down when it came to Starfield. The one argument that Xbox had that came out just like a little petty to me is that they said Sony is using money that they make off of Xbox games to buy exclusivity on stuff like Final Fantasy 16. And yeah, I guess I kind of see what they mean between stuff like Deathloop, Ghostwire Tokyo, because Xbox does own those games, Minecraft Legends. I think Grounded might be over on PlayStation at this point as well. I'm not sure. So yeah, any sales of those games, 30% of it goes over to Sony. So I guess like if you really want to get down to brass tacks, they are using money they made off Xbox games to buy exclusivity, but it's not like they enacted a plan here. It's just like a consequence of the fact that Xbox decides to sell games on PlayStation. I think the real silver lining here with this whole Xbox versus the FTC and all these other global entities thing is that it looks like it's going to wrap up sooner rather than later. And no matter what happens, Sony kind of wins, right? Like Diablo 4 looks like it's going to be Blizzard's biggest launch in years, and Blizzard is owned by Activision. But as we all know, Diablo 4 is available on the PlayStation 5. So even if this deal goes through, all of the content updates and everything like that in terms of battle passes and expansions, that will most assuredly come to PS5 in the future, which is great. And no matter what happens, we're at least going to get Call of Duty on PlayStation for the next 10 years. And who knows how big Call of Duty is going to remain. I mean, I know every year it still sells more and more copies. We have some off years like Vanguard and stuff like that, but it still is a really heavy hitting franchise. But who's to say that something doesn't come in and sort of usurp it and take over its spot as the biggest shooter in the industry? The odds of that happening, I feel like, of course, are pretty slim, but it's not impossible. And no matter what, 10 years is a really long time to have these games on PlayStation. And if they are selling extremely well, I don't think it's really going to be a situation where Xbox can remove Call of Duty from PlayStation, because I don't think they literally can afford to. Also, we got some more weird information out of this where Xbox basically said they lost the console war, which is crazy to hear come out of Xbox's mouth. I know there's a bunch of ways that's being spun as a positive thing just to prove why they're going towards Game Pass and getting their games on a bunch of different services and consoles and devices, but I don't think that was something that ever should have came out of Xbox's mouth. Because even if it is officially true and they've lost the console war to Sony and Nintendo, I don't think it's worth admitting because they have a ton of fans. I was at the Xbox showcase with Ray. They have a whole fan fest thing that goes on concurrently with that, and I was shocked at how many people actually showed up just to see the whole Xbox situation that they had going on there. Oh, and going back to the Call of Duty situation, I guess we got some leaks that basically let us know that Jim Ryan knew the entire time that Xbox would never allow PlayStation to not have Call of Duty, but he wanted to prolong this as long as possible, because if Xbox is embroiled in a legal battle, PlayStation can kind of just sit on the sideline and release games as they were. And you know, it's just becoming a really messy situation, but overall, thankfully, it looks like it's going to wrap up. And most importantly, no matter what happens, it seems like PlayStation is going to come out on top, to the point where even Xbox thinks so. And then finally, I just wanted to showcase this cool PS5 I saw over on the PlayStation subreddit. Basically what someone did is they made side plates for their PS5 that look like granite. And before you think about how heavy this PS5 would be with granite side plates, these are just spray painted. It's like a really cool effect. So basically what the user Real Ludo Kresh did is he bought gray primer, put that on his PlayStation 5, and then he got Rust-Oleum stone finish spray paint. And that's what gave it the granite texture. And then finally he used some clear coat and got what you're seeing on screen right now. I think this is really cool. I would love to see some stuff like this from Sony. The ones that I really came around on were the gray camo plates. I haven't brought those up in a while, but you know, at first I was like, those don't look too good. And then I realized that they hid PlayStation logos and buttons inside the actual camo print. And then I was like, oh, I'm on board for that. Never really picked them up just because I like the dark plates. But yeah, if you've ever customized your own plates and you maybe want me to show them off in a video, you can send them to me at Jimmy Champagne on Twitter. Anyway, guys, that's all I've got for you in this video. Let me know what you think down in the comments below. And remember to subscribe subscribe and set your notifications to all if you haven't already. As always, my name is Jimmy Champagne. I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching and shape on.